In an earlier video, we discussed Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, a better way to deal with each other. Today, we will have a look at the most important book on the subject, Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today I've got another book review for you. We will have a look at Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. Rosenberg was a US-American psychologist, and same as Thomas Gordon, he was a pupil of Carl Rogers. He developed the method of nonviolent communication and obviously also published books about it, but it was a bit difficult to figure out when exactly those were published. As far as I could find out, Rosenberg first published a text about nonviolent communication in 1983. It was just 35 pages, so not really a book, more of a short document, and it was called A Model for Nonviolent Communication. The first actual book I could find was 1999, A Nonviolent Communication, a Language of Compassion, the predecessor of this one, and this one was published in 2015, and it's called Nonviolent Communication, a Language of Life. There are plenty of other books about nonviolent communication, both by Rosenberg himself and by other people, but this is the most important one. Small note, I did a previous video about nonviolent communication itself, about the method, and it is helpful to watch this before you watch this book review, or if you have some previous knowledge about nonviolent communication, because here I won't describe the method in detail. I will focus on the book, on the contents and structure on the book. So let's have a look at it. The first chapter is called Giving from the Heart, and there Rosenberg gives a brief overview of nonviolent communication. He explains that it is not merely a technique for communication, but it is more of a philosophy, a general approach to dealing with one another. And he says the basis of our interactions is compassion. However, in our day-to-day lives, we often act in ways that lead us astray, that take us away from compassion and that block compassion. And this is a kind of violent communication. Rosenberg also calls it jackal language. You probably remember those two guys from the nonviolent communication video. The jackal language represents our usual day-to-day communication, and the giraffe language represents nonviolent communication. Rosenberg also briefly explains the four basic components of nonviolent communication, which are observations, feelings, needs, and requests. And he explains the two parts of nonviolent communication: expressing ourselves empathically and receiving empathically. And this is also a short roadmap for the chapters to come, because in those concepts and topics will be explained in more detail. Chapter 2 discusses the jackal language, communication that blocks compassion. The kind of communication we usually use in our day-to-day lives. For example, we use moral judgment. He's lazy. You don't do that, it's not proper, things like that. And there are several more, such as comparing, disguising responsibility, expressing our desires as demands, and many more. The third chapter deals with observations, the first component of nonviolent communication. And the important thing here is to observe without evaluating, without judging. And this is difficult to do. It's hard for us to really tell the difference. If I say, Sam ignored me at the meeting, is this an observation or a judgment? You might say observation because that's what he did. But in this case, it really is a judgment because it's my interpretation of his actions and his motivations. And an observation would be to say, for example, Sam did not ask for my opinion in the meeting. Now this might seem like a very slight and unimportant difference, but it really is quite important because if I judge, then the other person will go into the defensive and maybe start justifying themselves or whatever, and the whole conversation will move in a direction that is not really useful. Chapter 4 deals with identifying and expressing feelings, the second component of nonviolent communication. Now, expressing feelings is something we are often not used to, something we first need to learn. And our language doesn't make it a lot easier because our language is often confusing here. There are lots of sentences that start with I feel, such as I feel you don't take me seriously. And this is not a feeling at all, it's a judgment. And at the same time, we have sentences such as I am sad, that clearly express a feeling, but do not contain the words feeling or I feel. So it's all quite confusing. Often we need to first acquire a vocabulary for feelings, and the book provides a short list as a small help. Chapter 5 is about needs, the third component of nonviolent communication. It's called Taking Responsibility for Our Feelings. Because Rosenberg says what the other party says or does may be the stimulus for our feelings in this very moment, but it's not the cause. The cause for our feelings are our needs that aren't met, that aren't fulfilled. And we need to understand that and to take responsibility for our feelings and to absolve the other party of responsibility for our feelings. And again, expressing needs isn't something that comes easy to us. It's something we need to learn first. And again, the book provides a list, a vocabulary as a small help. Finally, in the 6th chapter, we learn about the fourth and final component of nonviolent communication, requests. It is very important how we phrase our requests. For example, we should always say what we want and not what we don't want. We should not tell others to stop doing something or not do something, but we should clearly tell them what we want them to do. And there are further factors like that. And it's also quite important to distinguish between demands and requests. If I make a demand, the other person can only choose between submission and rebellion. A demand basically says, do as I tell you or else. If I make a request, it's really up to the other party whether they want to honor my wish or not. In the previous chapters, Rosenberg focused on how we can express ourselves empathically. Now, in the 7th chapter, we learn how to receive empathically. And here it is very important to really listen to the other party. What we usually do in a conversation is we quickly shift attention to ourselves. The other person tells us something, and then we quickly go and say, for example, with some advice, oh, what you should do is this and that. Or maybe with some criticism. Well, it's really your own fault if you did whatever. And there are several more varieties of ways to shift attention to ourselves. I like topping, by the way, which is like, oh, this is nothing. Let me tell you about what I experienced once. And there are many more. And we should not do that. We should not shift attention to ourselves and make the conversation about us, but we should keep listening and really try to understand the other person. And we should try to identify the observations and feelings and needs and requests the other person has. And to check if we are on the right track, we can use paraphrasing, which means we repeat what the other person has said in our own words as we understood it. For example, I might say, oh, you want to be respected by Sam, and that's why you were disappointed when he did not ask for your opinion in the meeting. Is that correct? You might find this approach quite similar to active listening by Carl Rogers, and it really is, as I mentioned before, Rosenberg was a pupil of Rogers, so there are certainly some similarities in their approaches. The 8th chapter is called The Power of Empathy, and this is pretty much a summary and a conclusion to the first chapters and to the general introduction to nonviolent communication. Here Rosenberg emphasizes the positive effects empathy can have. For example, he explains that if someone really listens to us, it can help us see things in a new way, to overcome problems, to move on. So there really are a lot of positive effects, and there are a lot of ways empathy can have a positive influence on situations and on conversations. In the following chapters, Rosenberg explains different areas of application where we can use nonviolent communication. And first of all, in chapter 9, he explains how we can use nonviolent communication to connect compassionately with ourselves. Because all those problematic behaviors we use when dealing with others, such as judging and blaming and so on, we also use those on ourselves. If I say, for example, oh, what an idiot I was. I shouldn't have done this, I should have done that, and I was so wrong and whatever. And this is certainly not helpful. Instead, I should try to understand the needs I have that aren't fulfilled and to understand the feelings I have. And Rosenberg explains how we can do that. He explains a technique called NVC mourning and self-forgiveness that we can use if we are unhappy with ourselves, if we regret our actions afterwards. And nonviolent communication can just be applied after things have gone wrong, but it also provides a general approach to our actions and to our lives. Rosenberg says, don't do anything that isn't play. Our actions should not be motivated by fear or guilt or shame or obligation, but by a desire to contribute to life. We should do what we want and not what we must. Now, this is an approach that is probably familiar to a lot of those who have been here for a while, that we encounter frequently. The idea that we should take control of our lives and really make our own decisions and not just be pushed around by outer influences and by the general situation. So in dealing with ourselves, it's important to be empathic with ourselves and also to align our actions with our own needs and values. Chapter 10 is about expressing anger fully. Because a nonviolent communication is not about suppressing anger and always being sweet and nice to everybody. That's not the idea. However, as we learned before, other people may be the stimulus for our feelings in a certain situation, but they are not the cause. The cause are our own needs that are not fulfilled. Therefore, blaming and punishing others is a superficial expression of anger, and what we should do instead is really understand our feelings, identify our needs, take responsibility for our feelings, and absolve the other person of responsibility for our feelings. And if we can do that, we can really move on towards a solution. And Rosenberg provides guidance and steps on how we can do that. Chapter 11 deals with conflict resolution and mediation, which is probably quite an obvious application of nonviolent communication because that is what Rosenberg himself did a lot. He even used nonviolent communication to mediate in armed conflicts between parties that were killing each other and that tried to negotiate. And Rosenberg says the approach of nonviolent communication to conflict resolution and mediation is quite different from classic methods, because in nonviolent communication, at first we don't deal with the acute problems and factual issues. We don't deal with those at all. At first we try to understand what the needs of both parties are, and we try to create an empathic connection. And only after that, we discuss factual issues and seek strategies to fulfill the needs of both parties. And we have established the needs of both parties and an empathic connection. Then, for example, a no is not just a rejection, but we can say, all right, which needs do prevent the other party from saying yes? And how can we fulfill them? How can we find a solution that will work? The 12th chapter deals with the protective use of force. In which situations is physical force justified and in which is it not? Now, this chapter might come as a bit of a surprise, but it is quite justified, as we will see in a moment, because Rosenberg says, if communication is not possible anymore and there is imminent danger, then it is justified to use physical force to prevent injury and to prevent injustice. But we must never use physical force to punish or to enforce change. Because violence and punishment will create resistance to exactly the behavior we are trying to achieve. And furthermore, we need to ask ourselves not just which behavior do I want to see, but also which motivation for that behavior do I want. For example, do I really want my kids to do something because they are afraid that they will be beaten? And this is the basic idea of this chapter. Rosenberg here takes a clear stance against physical punishment, against children, and against punishment in general. And I guess physical punishment against children isn't as common today as it was maybe 50 years ago, but it probably is still present, and therefore I guess it makes sense to have this chapter because it's quite important. Chapter 13 is called Liberating Ourselves and Counseling Others, and there Rosenberg discusses a nonviolent communication in the context of therapy. He says that using nonviolent communication, we can overcome problematic behavior that is maybe deeply rooted, that we have maybe acquired as small children, and we can get rid of that. We can diffuse stress, we can overcome inner conflict. He even says we can overcome depression. I wouldn't be too sure of that. I don't know if that is scientifically proven, but there are certainly a lot of applications for nonviolent communication here. And Rosenberg also describes how he used nonviolent communication as a therapist himself. By the way, he also voices some skepticism towards the classic approach to diagnosing mental illnesses, where you pretty much check boxes and say, oh yeah, this patient fulfills all the criteria for whatever depression, and this patient is borderline, and there you go, standard treatment, and that's it. And I don't have detailed knowledge about that subject, but as far as I know, this is pretty much the approach psychotherapy takes nowadays. That you don't just tick boxes and do some standard diagnosis, but that you try to really look at the individual patient and their problems and the issues they have. So Rosenberg here probably was a small step ahead of his time. Finally, the 14th and last chapter deals with expressing appreciation in nonviolent communication. Now, this should be easy, since appreciation is something positive, isn't it? Well, yes, but there are still some problems. First of all, if I give a compliment, it is still a judgment. It is a positive judgment, but it is still a judgment. And of course, by doing so, I put myself in a higher position where I am qualified to judge another. And I am qualified to decide whether they are doing good. And also in day-to-day life, we are often hesitant to give praise, to give appreciation. But at the same time, we often long for appreciation. Think about how many people say that they don't get enough appreciation at their workplace. And finally, even if we get praise and appreciation, we often have difficulties accepting it. And furthermore, sometimes we use praise and appreciation in a manipulative way. For example, if managers praise the employees because they hope that this will raise morale and performance. So there are quite some issues there. And Rosenberg explains how to express appreciation in nonviolent communication, again with the steps and a detailed description. At the very end, there is a short epilogue, a story about Rosenberg's grandmother and a vagabond called Jesus the Lord, who lived in her home for a while, whom she took in. And this grandmother was a person who really embodied these ideals of empathy and compassion, who really used and expressed this in their life. And this grandmother was a big influence on Rosenberg. Finally, let's proceed to the critique. My first impression of the book was actually mixed. There is praise for the book on the cover, on the back, and the first few pages also contain praise for the book. This I found to be a bit too much. And furthermore, I was a bit surprised to find that in the book frequently Rosenberg quotes poems or songs by himself or by people he knows. And this was a bit unusual for me. However, what I was really impressed with right from the start was how easy the book is to approach and to understand. It is written in quite an easy and understandable way, And frequently we have these small gray boxes at the side that contain key expressions from that section that help us to understand what this section really is about, what is most important in it. At the end of each chapter, we have a short summary. Most chapters at the end have a practical example and we see in action. Most chapters also have a small exercise at the end. So I've rarely seen a book that goes to such great length to make it as easy as possible for me as the reader to understand it and to understand the topic. And this I really like. The structure and content also makes sense for me. I think it's a good approach to first present the method itself and to explain it in some detail, and then to explain the different areas where it can be applied, because this again helps to further your understanding of the method itself and to really get a grip on things. And I do like the method itself, and especially the philosophy and the view of people and of the world that's behind it. And I can accept it from someone like Rosenberg, who didn't just preach this in nice cozy seminars and who maybe used it to resolve a marriage conflict here and there, but the guy really used this to mediate in armed conflicts between people who had been killing each other before. He worked with convicts who committed atrocious crimes like murder and other violent crimes. At the same time, he also worked with victims of violent crimes. There are some examples in the book that are really disturbing, and I really respect the fact that Rosenberg really did not shy away from this, and that he really went through all that and dealt with the difficult cases and was still able to maintain this view of compassion and empathy and nonviolent communication. And I also like the fact that he emphasizes the way we deal with ourselves and that we should apply nonviolent communication to ourselves. This makes sense because if I keep judging and blaming myself, how am I supposed to approach others in a positive way? So I think this is really important. Bottom line is, I certainly recommend the book. As I said before, it is the most important book, the most important source about nonviolent communication. So if you are interested in the method and want to learn more about it, this is a good place to start. And as I said, it really is easy to read, fun to read, and easy to understand. If you've watched this far, you've reached the end of the video. I really appreciate that. It shows appreciation for my work here. If you want to give me positive feedback, you can click the like button below the video. And if you would like to see more videos from me, I would be quite happy if you subscribe to the channel. We will see each other again next week. For today, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.